Welcome, one and all, well, maybe not one and all, to a special patron-only episode of Pet Squares, a geek's guide to the Beach Boys. I'm your host, Adam Marsland. If you're not a patron of the channel or a contributor, the reason you're seeing me is it's my custom on the rare occasions I do these to put the first 20 to 30 minutes of this show up on YouTube for general consumption so all of you can see what you're missing by not being a patron or subscriber of the show, thus hopefully encouraging you to become one. But to be honest, I really just wanted to do this as a thank you for the many people that, many relative to the fairly modest subscriber base of this channel who have stepped up and contributed to the show and become patrons. It has really helped me in many a way. And it's been about a year since I've done one of these. I had fully intended to do this a long time ago, like so many other things. I do tend to get around to doing things, but they do tend to take time because I want to do them right, and I don't have every hour of my waking day to devote to this, but I sure wish I did. And to the extent that I can devote time to this, it's largely to the support and help of you, the watcher, and especially you folks that contribute and are patrons to the channel. So this is for you, and I want to again just say I'm so happy that you're watching. I'm so happy that you enjoy the content enough to support it. So what we're going to be doing today is we're going to be looking at the outside productions of Brian Wilson in the year of our Lord 1964. This is picking up from where we were in the last bonus episode where we were talking about the second half of 1963. To keep me honest and on track, I have Andrew Doe's fine website, Bellagio10452.com, to refer to the timeline of the year and the events therein. I've also received significant help on this episode from Beach Boys archivist Craig Slawinski, who gave me a lot of information about the sessions, as he is the world's foremost expert on same. And also got some very valuable insight from Mark A. Moore, who is the world's leading expert on the exploits of Jan Berry and Jan and Dean. So they both gave me some really cool stuff to share with you, and I want to thank them for that. And I've gotten my little listening cap on, and I got some thoughts of my own to share. So without any further ado, let's look at Brian Wilson's outside productions for the year 1964. So if we go to the newly svelte Mr. Doe's website, we will see in the year 1964, before Brian started his hell year of touring all the time with the Beach Boys, he had one more spurt of studio stuff going on in January. And while he was cutting the Shutdown Volume 2 album, he also was doing some outside work with some other people. Now, we talked before on the 1963 bonus episode about the song I Do, which Brian cut twice with the Wrecking Crew, and both times used the Beach Boys on the recording. I Do was a rewrite of the song County Fair on the Surf and Safari album. Brian reworked it into what's frankly a superior song, sort of a very romantic song about one's marital vows, if you will, the commitment of marriage. Gets you right here. Anyway, the first take with the Wrecking Crew was a little sloppy, so Brian did it again. And then the Beach Boys did vocals, I believe, for both versions. And then he punted it over to a band called the Castells. And they actually had a single with it. I covered all this in the last episode, and I just want to bring it up because this did get recorded in January with all this other stuff that we're going to be talking about. And it's worth bringing up again because it's a terrific record, the Castells version. It's one of the few times that someone beat the Beach Boys, I think, at their own game. The Beach Boys version is really nice, but the Castells version is, I think, just as good, if not better, and it's driven by a powerhouse falsetto vocal that I believe was done by Chuck Girard, who was a guy that was working with the Castells and the Hondells and later became a Christian rock artist of some note. But what a terrific vocal he had. And we are going to be talking about Chuck Girard a little bit later as we get into what happened in 1964 with Brian, so I thought it was worth bringing that one up again. That record came out on March 10th, did basically nothing. So that gets us into the new stuff. The very first thing that happens, January 2nd, is Brian, we're going to get to Paul in a second. Brian produces a song for a guy named Paul Peterson. Paul Peterson was an actor. He had been on the Mickey Mouse Club. He was a Mouseketeer, as was Annette Funicello, who we'll be talking about shortly. At that time, he was famous as a regular actor on the Donna Reed show. Peterson already knew the Beach Boys, Carl and Dennis, because he was a big car freak, and so were those guys. Now, Brian wrote this song at the request of producer Lou Adler, who you might remember worked with Screen Gems, if I recall correctly, but he was a producer with Jan and Dean, and would soon be the producer for the Mamas and Papas. A cat to know, and a friend of Brian's. Lou asked Brian to do a song for Paul because Lou was dating Shelley Fabre, who was on the Donna Reed show with Paul Peterson. You see, this is how things get done in Hollywood. Anyway, so apparently Paul Peterson was off, I think he was in Nevada somewhere. He was off somewhere for New Year's Eve. Got a call from Lou Adler, say, Brian Wilson wrote you a tune, come on back. So he did, gets on a plane, and right after New Year's, Paul's in the studio with the track that Brian had already cut. This was a bit of a production get for Brian, as Paul Peterson actually, despite being mostly known as an actor, had a little bit of a run of success as a singer. He had 6 chart singles out of his past 8 releases. She Rides With Me, which is the name of the song. If I didn't say so before, I'm an idiot, sorry. She Rides With Me, the song in question, was a whiff, not a hit, continuing Brian's regrettable streak of not having much luck as a producer as opposed to a songwriter outside of the Beach Boys umbrella. But it's a really cool recording that is, like most of Brian's outside productions in 1964, fairly simple compositionally. But it's a lively track, and it's mostly distinguished by being what is likely the first ever recording to have the vocals processed through a Leslie speaker. If you recall when we talked about the song You're So Good to Me on the prior episode that I just recorded about the Beach Boys Summer Days and Summer Nights album, that song featured a guitar run through a Leslie, one of the first instances of that. Although not the first, the Beatles beat them to it by a month or two, which would become a popular effect. And putting all kinds of things through this rotary speaker, which was mostly used to create the swirling effect on a Hammond organ, became a production trick in the 60s and 70s, and quite a cool one. But this was the first time, to the best of anyone's knowledge, anyone had used the speaker to process vocals. This was apparently Lou Adler's innovation and not Brian's. It was done after the fact, after Brian left the session during the mixdown, I think. It's a pretty basic song with a kind of a pro forma piano solo a la Help Me Rhonda in the middle. But it's nice enough. She rides with me and she likes to go cruising, which is the part that's that's kind of a cool hook. From Craig Slowinski, the credits, which are on the internets, all of them, they're on the internet wrong, if we were to believe Craig. The track features Joe Gibbons and Tommy Tedesco, not Glenn Campbell, on guitar. David Gates, later of Bread fame, the guy wanting to make it with you, he's making it here on the session on bass guitar. The Ray Pullman doubling him on 6-string bass, Jimmy Bond on upright bass, the usual deal with Brian triple tracking the bass with 3 different tonalities. Al DeLore and Larry Knechtel, who would also be a member of Bread with David Gates later in the 70s, and also would play piano on Bridge Over Troubled Water. We've encountered Larry a few times before. They both played keyboards. The estimable Hal Blaine on drums. Plas Johnson, Steve Douglas, and Jay Migliore round out the Wrecking Crew sesh on saxes. And that covers She Rides With Me, Brian's first outside production in 1964. Now, according to Andrew Doe's website, sometime before the 12th of January, the Honeys, which was a girl group, sort of a sister group to the Beach Boys, that had among its membership Brian's soon-to-be wife, Marilyn Rovell, her sister Diane, and a woman named Sandra Glantz, who changed her name later to Ginger Blake. Actually, she had already changed her name, so she changed her name earlier to Ginger Blake. They were the Honeys. Brian had been working with them quite a bit the prior year. He would continue to work with them. So Brian had been working with the Honeys quite a bit the prior year. He would be continuing to work with them throughout 1964. So there is a report on Andrew's website that they cut 2 tracks called Boys Will Be Boys, What'll I Wear to School being the other one. I have been able to track down no information about these songs. So Andrew often contributes on the comments and was very kind enough to be very supportive of the show. So Andrew, I should have asked you, Andrew, if you knew what the deal with these songs was before I cut this thing. But I didn't, because I suck. So if you, Andrew, or anybody else wants to chime in with information on these Lost Honeys tunes, please be my guest, but I've been able to locate no information otherwise. However, Brian would be back in the studio on February 17th, the studio being Gold Star, cutting for the Honeys again. And here we have more information. Brian was working on the Honeys' new single called He's a Doll, and also preparing what was probably at that time meant to be a B-side, a song called I Can See Right Through You, which was later retitled Go Away Boy. That song has a torturous history. I'll get into that in a minute, but let's focus on He's a Doll. This song has a solo writer credit, and was for, as I said, their upcoming single, which would be their only single for Warner Brothers. And it's another, sort of tip of the hat to Phil Spector. That's kind of what Brian tended to do on his outside productions in this era. It starts with a descending major scale figure, and it has a really kind of purring lead vocal, which I really like. It should be noted Hal Blaine is going for it on there's like a bunch of stops where Brian has a big fill, and he nearly blows the take on the first fill. If you listen, he comes in late, and it's like, ah! So Hal has a moment where he's almost loses it. He's solid on the rest of it, though. That's at 1 minute and 35 seconds if you want to listen for Hal's near flub. I really like the up melody on this, where the song, she's so gorgeous. I like that. I don't know, something about that gets me. This is somewhat less feminist, if you will, than the prior Honeys singles. I really like the girl power vibe of the Honeys records. They were really stepping up their toe-to-toe, stepping up the edge of their surfboards to compete in the man's world. I like that kind of thing. And this is a little bit more just about adulation of a dude. Nothing wrong with that, but it, like I said, it purrs. It's a little more stroking the male ego than their prior work, but that's half their audience, perhaps more, so that's fine. This would be their last single, the Honeys' last single, until 1969, probably partly due to Marilyn's upcoming marriage to Brian and Brian's increased focus on first touring and then recording for the Beach Boys. This would be the last big year for Brian's attempt to be an outside producer. We'll see in early 1965 when Brian transitioned from using the Beach Boys as his primary studio band to using the Wrecking Crew as his primary studio band, and sort of using the Beach Boys increasingly for cameo musical roles. Brian's sort of duality as an outside producer versus being a producer for the Beach Boys started to diminish, and the ambitions Brian had channeled into his outside work, he started to combine that superior musicianship of the Wrecking Crew with the better compositional stuff he was bringing to the Beach Boys, and that's when we start getting the great run of albums with the Beach Boys today, Summer Days and Summer Nights, and of course Pet Sounds and Smile. So, but at this point, Brian's still doing the Beach Boys thing over here and doing the Wrecking Crew thing outside productions over there. Wrecking Crew for this, per Craig Swinsky, is Bill Pittman, Joe Gibbons, and Irvin Bud Coleman, not to be confused with Bud Melman of the David Letterman show. They are all playing guitar, Ray Pullman on bass, Jimmy Bond on upright bass, the great Leon Russell, Al DeLory, and Larry Knechtel once again on keyboards, Hal Blaine on drums, Gene Estes on percussion, a couple of percussion instruments, plus Steve Douglas, Plas Johnson, and Jay Migliore on saxes comprise the band for He's a Doll, and presumably the putative B-side, I Can See Right Through You, which is what we're going to cover next. So that brings us to I Can See Right Through You, Go Away Boy, which was probably intended to be the B-side, but was not completed at that time. It's a very similar rhythm track style and progression to Don't Worry Baby, which is sort of around this time. Yeah, it was, well, I wonder when Don't Worry Baby was. Let me see. Let's find out right now, shall we? It was out in May, so I'm not seeing the session right off the bat, but if Don't Worry Baby came out in May and this was in February, it would be right around the same time. So a contemporaneous thing to Don't Worry Baby, and perhaps the similarity to Don't Worry Baby is the reason why it was not completed. It's got a very unusual kind of pedal organ figure in the back. It's not something Brian did a lot. Hal, once again, going crazy with the tom-toms. Hal loved his tom-toms. It's very different from Dennis, who tended to just lean on the snare, or a snare and a floor tom together. The toms never let up on this recording. So this was eventually finished and redone much later in 1983 when the Honeys made an album called Ecstasy. At that time, it was revamped into a song called Go Away Boy. And again, a little more girl power, more in line with their previous work. Like my favorite line, I can see who I really am now. You know, it's kind of that kind of a song. It also was covered by, a band called the Pearl Fishers for the Caroline Now compilation album, which was something that came out, if I recall correctly, the mid to late 90s, sometime around, maybe it might have been early 2000s, but it was a compilation of independent bands doing Brian Wilson tracks, quite a few of which were fairly unknown. So this was one of those songs. And I would assume the musicians are identical to the prior track, but I don't know that for a fact. So this gets us to the actual B-side of Ced Warner's single, which is a very peculiar little track called The Love of a Boy and a Girl. And I say it's peculiar because it's another one of these Brian B-sides that sounds like it was done in someone's living room. It's a very spare recording with just a basic kind of doo-wop piano, someone clicking a pair of drumsticks with reverb on them, and a kind of a thin bass line. And I was very curious to hear what the story was behind this. It certainly does sound like a song that was that they had just come up with to replace a song that was intended to be the B-side. It was a very sort of homegrown kind of thing. Craig supplied the background on this track, which I thought was really interesting. It's apparently Diane Rovell and Ginger Blake on the piano parts. Diane Rovell clicking the sticks, dropping time at a few junctures, it must be said, although not the easiest thing to do, just clicking on 2 and 4. Brian playing a bass line on a guitar, apparently. Another rare Brian sighting, although, again, as we've seen, Brian usually when he did play guitar, he was just playing single notes the same as he did on the bass. Although apparently he did play some chords on Girl Don't Tell Me, and a very interesting picture surfaced on Facebook a few weeks ago of Brian pretending to be Elvis at a party, and he's playing guitar and singing. He's like goofing around, but the thing is, he is playing an F-sharp major chord with a reach around thumb voicing, which is not a beginner's chord, and I was very surprised to see it because for him, and he had it fingered exactly right. It wasn't like sloppy fingering. It was the way you play that. It's the way I play the chord. It's the way you play that chord if you do that particular kind of thumb reach around inversion. So that one picture does imply that Brian not only knew chords on the guitar, but he had some knowledge of advanced chords and how to finger them. So I was very surprised to see that picture. So Steve Desper, who was the Beach Boys in-house engineer in the late 60s and early 70s, has claimed that Brian was actually a pretty decent guitar player. There's not much evidence of this, but it's worth bringing up that he did play guitar once in a while. And according to Desper, the reason Brian didn't play guitar very often, he just preferred the piano because it has the layout of all of the, you can see all the relationships of the bass line to the chords, and you can see why Brian would prefer that because the bass line and the bass voicings are so integral to his writing. And so I could see why Brian would, even if he could play decent guitar, wouldn't like the guitar because for him it would be sort of an incomplete instrument. It wouldn't encompass the whole composition. For him, it would be sort of a fill-in kind of instrument. So I can kind of see why, if Brian could play guitar, why he wouldn't. But be that as may, he played guitar on this, albeit he just played a bass on the guitar. He played bass line on guitars for whatever reason. It's kind of going back to this sort of homegrown thing, which was done at a studio. I didn't know which one. I think it was a Gold Star again. So it does, like I said, it sounds like it was done in somebody's basement or something, but it was a proper studio recording. But it does sound like a rush job when the other track wasn't used either because it wasn't deemed good enough or it was too similar to Don't Worry Baby, as I just speculated. But it is kind of an interesting curio in the Honey's discography. Now I'm going slightly out of chronological order because the Honey's original session was done on February 17th, and this was another little break from touring for Brian, and so he had a little spate of recording sessions around this time, a few of them for the Beach Boys, but there's going to be 2 other outside sessions that we cover here. On February 16th, Brian participated in the recording session for Jan and Dean's hit single and one of their most beloved, to those in on the secret, recordings, the theme song from the film Ride the Wild Surf. This was a Jan, Brian, Roger Christian co-composition. It went to number 16 in the summer 1964. It was a theme from a movie that was quite interesting because although of course there had been films in the beach movie realm and also Gidget and things of that nature for the last 5 years, this was the first movie that took surfing and the surf subculture kind of seriously. People are kind of divided on whether this is a good movie or not because there's a lot of cheese into it. Guys back projected against big waves, and one guy had his hair very obviously dyed blonde to distinguish him from the other blonde guys. I think one of the guys was an actual surfer, so that was kind of interesting. But it would be that as it may, it was a movie that, as I said, took the surfing subculture seriously, made at least some attempt to portray that outside the whole Frankie Avalon realm of lifestyle. If I recall correctly, Jan and Dean were supposed to appear in the film as well, but they got kicked out because, this is a really weird story, a buddy of Dean's had kidnapped Frank Sinatra's son. I am not kidding. This is not The Onion. And Dean apparently had some role in this kidnapping. I think, I mean, he didn't, obviously he'd be in jail if he had a conscious role in it. But apparently Dean had provided some funding for this, thinking it was a joke or that it was just, or some